Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. This is Roger K. Green, and we are doing a contextualized reading of Book 9 of Homer's Odyssey for our course, Homer and the Critique of Western Civilization. Odysseus here becomes a storyteller, and he opens the book by once again praising the bard Demodocus, who's the bard of the Phaeacians. And he says, Alcanu's majesty shining among your island people, what a fine thing it is to listen to such a bard as we have here. The man sings like a god. The crown of life, I'd say. There's nothing better than when deep joy holds sway throughout the realm, and banqueters up and down the palace sit in ranks, enthralled to hear the bard, and before them all the tables heaped with bread and meats, and drawing wine from a mixing bowl, the steward makes his rounds and keeps the wine cups flowing. This, to my mind, is the best that life can offer. We know that Odysseus has been emerging as a culture hero, that he's been traveling around, that he is getting the best from the Phaeacians, and that he is in turn going to tell them about himself here and all of the things that he's learned on his journeys. He says, but now you're set on probing the bitter pains I've borne, so I'm to weep and grieve, it seems still more. Well then, what shall I go through first? What shall I save for last? He starts this composing process. But we are leading up to the theme of this chapter, which is that Odysseus here is identifying himself. This will repeat throughout the book 9. But he tells the Phaeacians, I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, known to the world for every kind of craft. My fame has reached the skies, sunny Ithaca is my home. Atop her stands our sea mark, Mount Neriton's leafy ridges shimmering in the wind. Around her a ring of islands circle side by side. Dulichian, Same, wooded Zacynthus too, but mine lies low and away, the farthest out to sea, rearing into the western dusk, while the others face the east and breaking day. Mine is a rugged land, but good for raising sons, and I myself, I know no sweeter sight on earth than a man's own native country. And so this theme of nostalgia, remember nostalgia means homesickness, is showing up here as well. It shows up throughout the text, and in some ways the big epic itself is framed in terms of nostalgia, if we're thinking about it being the tale of Odysseus's journey home. But remember that we've also opened with Telemachus, with the sun, and we spent quite a bit of time with him in the early books of the epic. Odysseus continues, true enough, Calypso, the lustrous goddess, tried to hold me back deep in her arcing caverns, craving me for a husband. So did Circe, holding me just as warmly in her halls, the bewitching queen of Aea, keen to have me too. But they never won the heart inside of me, never. So nothing is as sweet as a man's own country, his own parents, even though he's settled down in some luxurious house off in a foreign land and far from those who bore him. No more. Come, let me tell you about the voyage fraught with hardship Zeus inflicted on me, homeward bound from Troy. And so we get this little mentioned group of people, the Cicones or Cicones, and Odysseus jumps into the return from Troy, and he says, the wind drove me out of Ilium onto Ismarus, the Cicones' stronghold. There I sacked the city, killed the men, but as for the wives and plunder, that rich haul we dragged away from the place. We shared it round, so no one, not on my account, will go deprived of his fair share of spoils. Now, this is another one of those moments where we need to pause for the people who are defending Western civilization in the eye of the idea of Western civilization, and Odysseus being a culture hero of the foundations of Western civilization. We don't know why he decides to sack this city. It just seems to be there. And they sack him. They sack it, and they wipe out the men, and the women are made into plunder along with the rest of what the rich haul that they drag in. So we get a couple of mentions of these people, but we don't get any elaboration as to why. Why did Odysseus do this? So then I urged them to cut and set sail, but would they listen? No, those mutinous fools, his crew. There was too much wine to swill, too many sheep to slaughter down along the beach, and shambling longhorn cattle. All the while, the Cicones sought out other Cicones, called for help from their neighbors living inland, a larger force, stronger soldiers too, skilled hands at fighting, men from chariots, skilled when a crisis broke, to fight on foot. Out of the morning mist they came against us, packed as the leaves and spears that flower forth in spring, and Zeus presented us with disaster, me and my comrades doomed to suffer blow on mortal blow. Lining up both armies, battled it out against our swift ships, both raked each other with hurtling bronze lances. Long as morning rose and blessed day grew stronger, we stood and fought them off, massed as they were. But then, when the sun wheeled past the hour for unyoking oxen, the Cicones broke our lines and beat us down at last. Out of each ship 6 men at arms were killed. The rest of us rode away from certain doom. They go and they mourn the deaths of these soldiers. But there's no thought, should we have gone and sacked that city? What did they do to us? There's none of that kind of conscience at work among the Greeks here. Now Zeus, who masses the storm clouds, but there is thanks to the gods here. So he says, I would not let our rolling ships set sail until the crews had raised a triple cry, saluting each poor comrade cut down by the fierce Cicones on that plain. Now Zeus, who masses the storm clouds, hit the fleet with the north wind, a howling demonic gale shrouding over the thunderheads and the earth and sea once more. So there's this mourning for the comrades. They set up some ritual to Zeus, but it doesn't seem to appease Zeus. The next day they move on, and then when dawn with her lovely locks brought on the third day, then stepping the masts and hoisting white sails high, we lounged at the oarlocks, letting the wind and the helmsman keep us true on course. And now at long last, I might have reached my native land unscathed, but just as I doubled Malaya's cape, a tide rip and the north wind drove me way off course, careering past Cythera. And then we get to the land of the Lotus Eaters, which has been immortalized in poetry. Odysseus's men go onto the island, and some of them meet these Lotus Eaters who, offer them lotuses to eat, and once they eat them, they lose their memory. But as they land at the island, Odysseus sends these crews out to do some intelligence work. Once we'd had our fill of food and drink, I set a detail ahead, 2 picked men and a third, a runner, to scout out who might live there. Men like us, perhaps, who live on bread. So off they went, and soon enough they mingled among the natives, lotus eaters who had no notion of killing my companions, not at all. They simply gave them lotus to taste, and instead, any crewman who ate the lotus, the honey-sweet fruit, lost all desire to send a message back, much less return. Their only wish to linger there with the lotus eaters, grazing on lotus, all memory of the journey home dissolved forever. But I brought them back. Back to the hollow ships, the streaming tears. I forced them and hauled them under the rowing benches, lashed them fast and shouted out commands to my other steady comrades. Quick, no time to lose, embark on the racing ships. And so there's this pause of the land of the Lotus Eaters. And then they sail on to the land of the Cyclops. Now, we've seen this idea of race that I've been unpacking throughout various contextualized readings and in more detail in the supplemental lectures on race and Western civilization that I've put onto the Critical Theory website and to my YouTube page. And the Cyclopses, so the Lotus Eaters would be another race of people. The Cyclopses as well. And we get some description here because Odysseus's men are sort of starting this kind of what looks like early forms of colonization. Let's send a detail of men off in to see who inhabits this place, and are they people like us? Right? That is the question. Or are they not? And if they're not, who are they? From there we sailed on, our spirits now at a low ebb, and reached the land of the high and mighty Cyclops, lawless brutes who trust so to the everlasting gods. They never plant with their own hands or plow the soil. Unsown, unplowed, the earth teems with all they need, wheat, barley, and vines, swelled by the rains of Zeus to yield a full-bodied wine from clustered grapes. They have no meeting place for council, no laws either. No, up on the mountain peaks they live in arcing caverns, each a law to himself, ruling his wives and children, not a care in the world for any neighbor. Now, a couple things I want to pause on here. So throughout Western civilization, the Odyssey and the Iliad have been used to teach young children, especially young boys, who dream of going off on adventures to foreign lands, who dream sometimes of conquering other lands. And when they meet other people or races of people, and we can think very much of the Europeans who come into contact with Native Americans, or what we now call Native Americans, because America, the name, did not work, or what did not exist yet. We could say something like Turtle Island, but that doesn't necessarily account for all peoples here. By here, I'm just saying that I'm on the continent that natives call Turtle Island. And the ways that Europeans characterized indigenous peoples around the world when they set on their course for colonization of the rest of the planet. Always, the people are described as not having culture, not having religion, and we can see this theme going all the way back to 700-ish years before the current era in an epic like the Odyssey. So the Cyclopses are not only lawless, but they have no agriculture, and they have no assembly, no agora, as the Greeks might have. We've seen earlier in the epic that even the gods have assemblies, that the different places, like the island of the Phaeacians, for example, call assemblies, that there's an order to all of these people that are sacrificing bulls as Telemachus comes into port to visit Nestor. So too, when we get to modern political philosophers, and I'll have more of this to say in future lectures that are more devoted to the notion, critiquing the notion of Western civilization, in the modern era. But we can see it with figures like John Locke and his second treatise on government, or various places, but a colonizer like John Locke, who says that uncultivated lands show that the Indians can live, or indigenous peoples can live, only with the right of rabbits and squirrels, of the wildlife. They're something like wildlife, but because they don't cultivate the land, or at least now we know, now we know that indigenous peoples, of course, highly cultivated the lands, but the Europeans couldn't see it. Nevertheless, the way that the Europeans determined their dominance over indigenous peoples was to claim that they did not cultivate the lands. And so John Locke, who had large plantations in what we now call the South in the United States, made all sorts of governmental treatises about how things should work, and he's clearly showing the influence of having read things like the classics of Western civilization, justifying the conquest of other peoples for being brutish, for being barbarians, and for not having at least recognizable agriculture, not having a recognizable government. And we might contrast this with this idea of freedom, that so many defenders of Western civilization will want to claim an abstract notion of freedom. Almost, I might invoke the libertarians here, who want less laws, who want smaller government. We see here that the Cyclopses seem to be minding their own business. Again, we don't really know why Odysseus and his crew are about to do what they do, but we've seen that there's a theme of these Greek people who go in and sack cities. They wipe out the men, they take the wives for slaves, and they take all of the goods that they can as plunder. So we again get that some of the reason here for what justifies them and what they do is that the Cyclopses are lawless to begin with. They live off the land, they don't cultivate things. So if I continue here around line 128. Now a level island stretches flat across the harbor, not close inshore to the Cyclops' coast, not too far out, thick with woods where the wild goats breed by hundreds. No trampling of men to start them from their lairs, no hunters roughing it with their woody ridges, stalking quarry, every raid their haven. No flocks browse, no plowlands roll with wheat, unplowed, unsown forever, empty of humankind. The island just feeds droves of bleating goats. For the Cyclops, no ships with crimson prows, no shipwrights there to build them good trim craft that sail them out to the foreign ports of call, as most men risk the seas to trade with other men. Such artisans would have made this island too a decent place to live. No mean spot, it could bear you any crop like in season. The water meadows along the low foaming shore, the run soft, the moist, and your hands, and your vines would never flag. The lands clear for plowing, harvest on harvest, a man could reap a healthy stand of grain. The subsoil's dark and rich. There's a snug, deep water harbor there. What's more, no need for mooring gear, no anchor stones to heave, no cables to make fast. Just beat your keel right out the days till your shipmate's spirit stirs for open sea and a fair wind blows. And last, at the harbor's head, there's a spring that rushes fresh from beneath a cave, and black poplars flourish round its mouth. So this is an intelligence gathering mission, right? There's a lot in this passage that we hear echoing in Christopher Columbus's voyages, for example, as he gives intel on the islands of Guanahani that he renames San Salvador. Again, I'll address more of that stuff in detail in future lectures. that are dedicated to the ongoing preservation of this idea of Western civilization. We might also think of this in terms of somebody who's been on land for a while, but Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, which is a gathering of intelligence for what the land has to offer, that he's giving to the French in case that there needs to be an alliance with the French against the British. So after this detail, and we want to compare the detail that's given in the beginning of this book here to the detail that's given in the beginning of the last book, to the palace of the Phaeacians, right? Of Alcinous and Arete. Everything's been sculpted, everything's built. There's statues of little boys holding up the torches that light the way in, gold and silver everywhere. This other place is untamed, no agriculture, lots of bleeding goats just for the taking. They're not even scared of humans. And some of those, just to jump into the invasion of the continent that I live on. Yes, this was another thing that Europeans remarked on, was that in some places it seemed like the wildlife were almost tame, and they were so easy to get. And this had to do with actually the ways that native peoples here on Turtle Island were working in relationship and cultivating land and growing crops and living in relationship with animal populations. So it seemed to the Europeans, who were used to animals running away from them, it seemed to them to be just for their taking. Around lines 168, when dawn rose with her rose red fingers shone once more, we all turned out, intrigued to tour the island. The local nymphs, the daughters of Zeus himself, flushed the mountain goats so the crews could make their meal. Quickly we fetched our curved bows and hunting spears. They just go on this hunting expedition, right? And then he reflects back on, all of the wares that they have back in their ships, right? The good red stocks in our vessels' holds had not run out. There was still plenty left. The men had carried off a generous store in jars. When we stormed and sacked the Kikones, holy city. Holy city. Now we stared across the Cyclops' shore, so near we could even see their smoke, hear their voices, their bleating sheep and goats. And when the sun had set and night came, we lay down land, slept at the water's shelving edge. When young dawn with her rose-red fingers shone once more, I called a muster briskly, commanding all the hands, "The rest of you stay here, my friends in arms. I'll go across with my own ship and crew and probe the natives living over there. Who are they? Violent, savage, lawless, or friendly to strangers, God-fearing men?" And so Odysseus goes on himself. He forges ahead. With that, I boarded the ship and told the crew to embark at once and cast off cables quickly. And they come to a giant's lair. Here was a giant's lair, in fact, who always pastured his sheep flocks far afield and never mixed with others. A grim loner, dead set in his own lawless ways. Here was a piece of work, by God, a monster built like no mortal who ever supped on bread. No, like a shaggy peak, I'd say, a man-mountain rearing head and shoulders over the world. So again, we get a description that's in contrast to the Phaeacians, but there's almost something offensive about, we don't know his name yet, his name hasn't been mentioned, but Polyphemus the Cyclops. This is one particular Cyclops who draws the ire of Odysseus, not only because he's lawless and, quote, savage, but because he has the offense of being a loner and living off alone, separate from other people. Basically, his offense is that he's minding his own business. excuse me. So now then, I told most of my good trusty crew to wait, to sit tight by the ship and guard her well, while I picked out my dozen finest fighters and went off. So again, that we should think about intent here, because this is something that always comes up in terms of Western civilization and law, and particularly the more recent laws about these ancient forms of sacking and genocide, which is, as Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term in the 1940s, says, it was a new term to designate an old crime. And so when we have these more recent laws that come in the 20th century, after the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, we are in the past, not even an entire century since that time, trying to deal with how can we erect as humans any kind of legal apparatus on the international level to address these ancient types of crimes. And so one thing that we think of in court, or a court of law, for example, is whether or not there is intent to a crime. Right, and so I'm going to focus a little bit on this, because Odysseus's intention here from the outset seems to be, I'm going to take 12 of my best fighting men, right? And we see this with away teams in Star Trek, right? And in Western civilization, I think that's a way that these tendencies towards colonization continue on. Now, it's framed in terms of scientific discovery and all sorts of lighter things, but we see Captain Kirk going down with away teams all the time in the original Star Trek, which seems a little bit ridiculous to send your highest ranking officers down. But over and over again, we see this way that the stories that we tell focus in on one particular hero, one captain, or maybe it's Will Riker, or maybe it's maybe it's Commander Spock or something like this, who go down and greet these other worlds. I think that's all part of Western civilization, and there are plenty of people who will defend Star Trek against me, but I will say that there is something colonizing about the very framing of the show Star Trek, whether it's Star Trek Discovery or whether it's the original Star Trek. So here, Odysseus has picked his away team, and they go off. And what he takes with him, though, is wine that he got from Marin. And this is an interesting little interruption to his story, because he gives a lot of detail to Marin, who is a priest of Apollo, and we know Apollo is one of the gods of wine. And we are not getting Bacchus here. We are not getting Dionysus, who's a god of wine, the wild one. We're getting Apollo, who is particularly associated with a more civilized notion of wine and cultivation here. So they had rescued, he says, Euanthes' son, a priest of Apollo, lord of Ismarus, because we'd rescued him, his wife and children, reverent as we were. He lived, you see, in Apollo's holy grove. And so this was during the time that they've sacked this city of the Kikones, but they've saved or rescued some person. I don't know if he's exactly a refugee or a captive, but he seems to have been saved because of his relationship to Apollo, who the Greeks worshipped. And so in return, this guy, Marin, gave me splendid gifts. He handed me 7 bars of well-wrought gold, a mixing bowl of solid silver, then this wine. He drew it off in generous jars, 12 in all unmixed, and such a bouquet, a drink fit for the gods. No maid or man of his household knew the secret store, only himself, his loving wife, and a single servant. Whenever they drink the deep red mellow vintage, 20 cups of water he'd stir in of wine, and what an aroma wafted from the bowl. What magic, what a godsend. And so wine is being mixed with water because of its potency, right? It's kind of like getting juice from concentrate. He says a sudden he fills a goat skin with it, and then a sudden foreboding told my fighting spirit I'd soon come up against some giant clad in power like armor plate, a savage, deaf to justice, blind to law. And so what laws, are we seeing? It's not like a written down constitution, but we will see at least one of the laws that Odysseus is referring to here. But look at what the party does. So the party goes and they find this empty cave of the Cyclops, and they invite themselves in. So they intrude into the cave. So we explored his den, gazing wide-eyed at it all, the large flat racks loaded with drying cheeses, the folds crowded with young lambs and kids, split into 3 groups. Here the young springborn, here the mid-yearlings, here the fresh sucklings off to the side. Each sort was penned apart, and all his vessels, pails, and hammered buckets he used for milking were brimmed full with whey. From the start my comrades pressed me, pleading hard, let's make away with the cheeses, then come back. Hurry, drive the lambs and the kids from the pens toward swift ships. So immediately the impulse is like, let's steal all of this stuff while we can, and then come back. But Odysseus won't give way. They set a fire, and then set our hands on the cheeses, offered some to the gods, and ate the bulk ourselves. So immediately they just help themselves to someone else's stuff. And back comes the Cyclops from his pasture late in the day, herding the flocks in. And he moves them in, sets this big stone wall over the door, and then he milks all of the females that he's brought into his lair, and then lights a fire and sees these foreigners, and he says, "Strangers," he thundered out, who are you? Where did you sail from over the running sea lanes? Out on a trading spree, or roving the waves like pirates, sea wolves raiding at will, who risk their lives to plunder other men? Now, one thing we could say is that even though the Cyclops is differently, regarded as a different race here, they're at least speaking the same language, and there's references to the same gods. So there is some sort of shared culture at work here. He says, Odysseus responds, "We are men of Achaea. We are bound now from Troy, driven far off course by the warring winds over the vast gulf of the sea, battling home on a strange tack, a route that's off the map. And so we've come to you, so it might please King Zeus's plotting heart. We're glad to say we're men of Atrides, Agamemnon, whose fame is the proudest thing on the earth these days. So great a city he sacked, such multitudes he killed. But since we've chanced on you, we're at your knees in hopes of a warm welcome, even a guest gift, the sort that hosts give strangers. That's the custom. Respect the gods, my friend. We're suppliants at your mercy. Zeus of the strangers guards all guests and suppliants. Strangers are sacred. Zeus will avenge their rights." So he's calling on Zeus, and he's calling on the law of Xenia. And this is the law that the Cyclops does not respect, of course. Now, we could look back and see, question perhaps how respectful Odysseus and his own men have been by invading this guy's lair, who seems to be minding his own business. And who doesn't seem to follow this, but knows who Zeus is. He says, "Stranger," he grumbled back from his brutal heart, "you must be a fool, stranger, or come from nowhere to telling me to fear the gods or avoid their wrath. We Cyclops never blink at Zeus or Zeus's shield of storm and thunder, or any other blessed god. We've got more force by far. I'd never spare you in fear of of Zeus's hatred, you or your comrades here, unless I had the urge. But tell me, where did you moor your sturdy ship when you arrived? Up the coast or close in? I'd just like to know. Now Odysseus is on to him. He knows that he's gathering intel so that he can go and stop the ships and get the other men that are out on the ships. And he has no fear of Zeus. And this, of course, according to the Greeks, breaks all of the laws to say that you are as powerful as the gods themselves. And so that is a kind of hubris, right? The excessive pride that shows up in Aristotle's Poetics. Odysseus is smart though, and he says he lies, and he says his ship has been destroyed by Poseidon. Now we know that Poseidon is a relative of the Cyclops as well. So the Cyclops is a descendant of Poseidon, but he has no fear of the gods, certainly not of Zeus. And then, not a word in reply, the ruthless brute, lurching up, he lunged out with his hands toward my men, and snatching two at once, rapping them on the ground, he knocked them dead like pups. Their brains gushed out all over, soaked the floor, and ripping them limb from limb, to fix his meal he bolted them down like a mountain lion, left no scrap, devoured entrails, flesh and bones, marrow and all. We flung our arms to Zeus. We wept and cried aloud, looking on at his grisly work, paralyzed, appalled. But once the Cyclops had stuffed his enormous gut with human flesh, washed it down with raw milk, he slept in his cave, stretched out all along his flocks. And so this becomes one of the most famous and enduring notions of what makes someone a brute, is that they eat humans, right? Or humans that eat other humans' flesh. The word is going to show up in Robert Fagel's translation here of cannibal, but cannibal is a recent word, and it comes from Christopher Columbus's interactions with particular people known as Caribs or Kannibals in the Caribbean. So it's a recent word, but the associations that get placed onto the Caribbean peoples as lawless savages dates back to this framing in Western civilization with the Cyclopses. So it's fitting that more recent term in English, which actually is not an English word, right? It's a Caribbean word, now has made its way into the lore of those who are caught in the spell of Western civilization. The use of the word cannibal to mean a flesh-eating, or somebody, humans who eat other humans who eat of their own kind, right? The idea is not the Caribbean idea. The idea is actually the European colonizers' idea that they have brought with their traditions going back to the ancient Greeks, that they've found during the Renaissance, or the rebirth of knowledge from the classics. And so we start seeing this kind of interaction with indigenous peoples that is framed by this idea of Western civilization. And it is embedded in the values of Western civilization that they go and they colonize, that they sack cities. They either meet people who are like them and then have this kind of guest friendship, and they exchange gifts, and they come home with huge bounties, or they sack cities. Odysseus then sets himself to strategizing. How are we going to get out of this? We're trapped in the Cyclops' lair. And he's asking himself, he's telling the story, right? He's building us up. Piercing whistles, turning his flocks to the hills, he left me there, the heart inside me brooding on revenge. The next day the Cyclops goes out. How would I pay him back? Would Athena give me glory? Here was the plan that struck my mind best. The Cyclops Great Club. They chop off a piece of the Cyclops' Great Club. They char it. They plane it down. They make it really sharp. And they toast it over the fire so it's hardened, right? And then nightfall comes. The Cyclops returns home, and Odysseus hatches his plan. And this is perhaps why he told us earlier in detail about the wine that he'd got. And he'd gotten the wine not just by sacking the Cicones, right? He didn't just steal their stores. He saved somebody who was more civilized and brings his potent civilized wine to the Cyclops. And he says that I lifted a carved bowl brimful of my ruddy wine, and went right up to the Cyclops, enticing, "Here, Cyclops, try this wine to top off the banquet of human flesh you bolted down. Judge for yourself what stock our ship had stored. I brought it here to make you a fine libation, hoping you would pity me, Cyclops, send me home, but your rages are insufferable, you barbarian. How can any man on earth come visit you after this? What you've done outrages all that is right." The Cyclops drinks it down. He loves it. He keeps asking for more. This is nectar or ambrosia from heaven. And he keeps wanting more. He says that he'll give a gift to Odysseus if he keeps giving him more. He also asks the name of Odysseus. That's a theme, right? Odysseus' identity in this book. I approached my host with cordial winning word. "So, you ask me the name I'm known by, Cyclops? I will tell you, but you must give me a guest gift as you've promised. Nobody, that's my name, nobody, so as my mother and father called me, all my friends." But he boomed back at me from his ruthless heart. "Nobody? I'll eat nobody last of all his friends. I'll eat the others first. That's my gift to you." With that, he toppled over, sprawled out. He's wasted. He's drunk. He even vomits his food, and the guts of the humans that he's eaten are vomited out. And then Odysseus and his men pick up the spear that they've made and hidden in the dung in the cave. And they hoist it together, 4 of them, and ram it into the monster's eye and then twist it. So we get a lot of detail here. And Odysseus is, of course, telling the Phaeacians of this brilliant plan that he's hatched. So this is not without its own kind of narcissism, to invoke another Greek myth of Narcissus. I drove my weight on it from above and bored it home as a shipwright bores his beam with a shipwright's drill. The men below, whipping the strap back and forth, whirl, and the drill keeps twisting faster, never stopping. So we seized our stake with its fiery tip and bored it round and round in the giant's eye, till blood came boiling up around that smoking shaft, and the hot blast singed his brow and eyelids round the core, and the broiling eyeball burst. Its crackling roots blazed and hissed. As a blacksmith, we get 2 quick similes in a row here. As a blacksmith plunges a glowing axe or adze into ice-cold bath, and the metal screeches steam and its temper hardens, that's the iron's strength. So the eye of the Cyclops sizzled round that stake. He loosed a hideous roar. The rock walls echoed round, and we scuttled back in terror. The monster wrenched the spike, and his roar actually is so loud that it arouses the questions from other Cyclopses on the island who call to him, and they say, "What, Polyphemus?" And this is where we get his name, Polyphemus, right? What is in the world is your trouble? And then he says, of course, "Nobody, friends. Nobody's killing me now by my fraud and not by force. If you're alone, then it must be the gods." So This is Odysseus's trick. So not only is Odysseus wily and strategic, he's able to play tricks with language itself. Now, they seem to be speaking the same language, which is kind of weird because the notion of a barbarian or a savage for Greeks was that was how they viewed people who could not speak Greek, but somehow the Cyclops and the Greeks are communicating in language, but it's not good enough language, apparently, for the Cyclops to recognize the meaning of nobody here. So the other Cyclopses say, you better pray to your father, Lord Poseidon. And then we've already heard earlier in the story that the reason why Poseidon is so angry with Odysseus is partly because of this blinding of his son, the Cyclops. So we're getting that Odysseus telling that story. It's just not in chronological order in the Odyssey as an epic. And again, we see Odysseus telling him his story. I was already plotting what was the best way out. How could I find escape? He didn't want to kill the Cyclops because they didn't want to be stuck in the lair, right? So there's kind of forethought that Odysseus has. My wits kept weaving cunning schemes, life at stake, monstrous death staring us in the face, till this plan struck my mind as best. And he famously has his men go beneath the sheep's fleece and have pairs of sheep take them out. And the last sheep left, Odysseus grips from underneath himself and holds on tight. And this is how they are let out the next morning and escape their death in Polyphemus's cave. And Polyphemus starts talking to the ram. He says, "Dear old ram, why the last of the flock took with the cave? In the good old days you'd have never lagged behind the rest. You with your long marching strides, first by far off the flock to graze your fresh young grasses, first by far to reach the rippling streams, first to turn back home, keen for your fold, when night comes on. But now you're last of all." And of course he's slowed down because Odysseus is clutching underneath him. "And why, sick at heart for your master's eye, that coward gouged out with his wicked crew, only after he'd stunned my wits with wine, what that nobody who's not escaped his death, I swear not yet. Oh, if only you'd thought like me, had words like me, to tell me where that scoundrel is cringing from my rage, I'd smash him against the ground, spill his brains." So Odysseus and his men get away, and Odysseus then, once they're far enough away, starts in his taunts, right? So Odysseus just can't help himself from taunting the Cyclops. And this is where he says, your filthy crimes come down on your head. You shameless cannibal is the word that Fagles chooses. Daring to eat your guests in your own house, so Zeus and the other gods have paid you back. And Polyphemus launches this boulder at them, and it pushes their ships back. They've been rowing away from shore. And again, Odysseus taunts him, even though they're scared, and his men are saying, "Don't taunt him anymore. We need to get away." But why are you being so headstrong? Again, Odysseus taunts him, and then they say, "Good God, the brute can throw." So they begged, but they could not bring my fighting spirit round. I called back with another burst of anger, and here this theme of Odysseus identifying himself comes out again. "Cyclops, if any man on the face of the earth should ask you who blinded you, shamed you so, say Odysseus, raider of cities, he gouged out your eye. Laertes' son, who makes his home in Ithaca." Tells him straight out who he is. And this brings back a memory to Polyphemus of his fate. He was fated to lose his eye to someone named Odysseus, but he thought it would be another giant, and so he mistook this dwarf or this human, and he tries to get Odysseus to come back. But instead he urges, because Odysseus is getting away, he's urging Poseidon, his father, to curse Odysseus or to get him while he's at sea. He says, Odysseus hurls back, not even your earthquake god himself can save you. And so this is where Odysseus has perhaps stepped beyond his role, right? His own hubris has gotten the best of him. And he says Poseidon himself cannot help you because you've broken Zeus's law, that law of Xenia, right? The law of hospitality, the stranger, welcoming the stranger. But then Polyphemus calls out to his father, Poseidon. Hear me, Poseidon, god of the sea, blue mane, who rocks the earth. If I really am your son, and you claim to be my father, come, grant that Odysseus, raider of cities, Laertes' son, who makes his home in Ithaca, never reaches home. Or if he's fated to see his people once again and reach his well-built house and his own native country, let him come home late and come a broken man, all shipmates lost, alone in a stranger's ship, and let him find a world of pain at home. And so this is the curse that's put on Odysseus through Polyphemus's prayer to his father. Odysseus tries to ease this situation by sacrificing to Zeus. And he says, but my sacrifices failed to move the god. Zeus was still obsessed with plans to destroy my entire oar-swept fleet and loyal crew of comrades. Now, all day long, the sun went down, and we sat and feasted on our sides of meat and heady wine. Then, when the sun had set and night had come, we lay down and slept at the water's shelving edge. When young dawn with her rose-red fingers shone once more, I roused the men straight away, ordering all crews to man the ships and cast off cables quickly. They swung aboard at once. They sat to the oars in ranks, and in rhythm churned the water, white with stroke on stroke. And from there we sailed on, glad to escape our death, yet sick at heart for the comrades we had lost. So this is Odysseus' first big tale, and of course it is about his identity, and he's been unveiled his identity to the Phaeacians, to whom he's telling the story, but he also unveils his identity to the Cyclops, and we also get the backstory of told in detail of why Poseidon is especially after him, and we see his balance, but we also see his cunning, right? We see the imbalance rather that Odysseus is capable of in terms of his taunts with Polyphemus, but also we see this racialized difference between the Cyclopses, who are lawless brutes who don't obey Zeus's law of Xenia. Now, at the same time, Odysseus is a sacker of cities. So these are the contradictions that I think those of us who are, or those of you, I don't think I'm defending it too much, but I wouldn't throw out, ancient texts. I guess that makes me a defender in some sense. But I'm not defending Western civilization. In this particular course, I'm asking us to think, if we want to inherit it, if we want to really think about what the enduring aspects of Western civilization might be that inform our society, my claim is that we need to then take a serious and sober look at all of the aspects of Western civilization. We don't just get to pick the good things. We don't just get to pick the things that we benefit from, like this computer that the technology that I'm using to talk to you all right now. These are all parts of the extractive efforts of Western civilization as well. Colonizing tendencies, global inequity, all sorts of things that I won't say that I don't benefit from, right? But if we are going to have people defend the ongoing exploitation, inequitable treatment of other people, especially along racist or white supremacist lines, then I think that it behooves us to look at all of Western civilization, to look at how inequity is naturalized within Western civilization, to look at the ways conquest is naturalized. What are the reasons for conquest? What are the reasons for alliances with different peoples? Again, it will take my supplemental lectures to really hash out these notions of whiteness, for example, or more recent notions of race and racism that don't exist in the ancient world, that then transform into the more recent notions of white supremacy. So these are what definitely more recent ideals, but the most vocal people who support white supremacy will have changed in the past 70-ish years since World War II, right? Nobody in the culture in the United States wants to out themselves as being just overtly a white supremacist, but right-wing and far right-wing politics has changed its tone to say, we're not white supremacists, we accept all people, but what we do is we value the enduring notions of Western civilization, which can be governance, freedom, all of these things that they will say goes back to the Greeks. And so what I'm saying is that if we're going to do that, and that's what this course is about, then let's look at the critiques of Western civilization. The critique comes from stepping back and seeing all of the aspects, good and bad, of what Western civilization has to offer, and how that has been treated and enfolded into our education systems up to the present day. Many of my students, again, will, not by choice of their own, they will go on to become high school teachers, and it will be in curriculum to teach a book like the Odyssey. I am not at all saying that I align with so-called cancel culture, that we should never read books like the Odyssey, but we should look, if it's going to be part of required curriculum, we should look at it honestly in all of its aspects, rather than just praising it as being the foundation of Western civilization. We should look at a culture hero like Odysseus for his strengths and for his flaws. He's an invader. He has intent to steal, to pillage. People like the Caeconians, who have apparently done nothing wrong to him. He will go in and raid a lair of a Cyclops just because the Cyclopses don't have laws like his own that are recognizable. Just because the Cyclops is a loner, like Polyphemus, who's minding his own business. So see, these are some of the charges. Maybe you agree with me or disagree with me on them. But of course, that's what this course is about, is to sort of bring up and engage with the critiques. I will have separate supplemental lectures coming up that deal with books like The Dialectic of Enlightenment from Adorno and Horkheimer, who are classic critical theorists. So that's how it's fitting into the broader notion of critical theory for the Center of Critical and Cultural Theory. You can see where I'm going with this. But I'm giving due attention to these texts that have been so revered in the history of Western civilization. I will say at the end here that I will refuse to charge Homer himself as the poet as being guilty of all that the so-called defenders of Western civilization have done since his time. I think that there are things that the poet naturalizes for sure, but as with other authors, William Shakespeare, for example, who often gets used in ways that he never intended as an author. I will keep a critical distance there. We don't. I don't know that it is Homer's intention, for example, in writing down the Iliad and the Odyssey and telling these stories to then wreak the kinds of havoc that modern forms of colonization have wreaked upon the world. But that's for later stories and later lectures. We'll continue on with these contextualized readings just to cover what is happening in the text itself and how we read this critique of Western civilization into the text. Is it the only way to read the Odyssey? Certainly not. It's in fact not the way that it's most often taught in the place where I live in the United States. It's often taught as being this revered book that everyone must know, that children must read, and that children often hate reading, honestly, because they're forced to read it in high school and they really don't care. But they're supposed to care about it because it has these virtues of Western civilization, which of course this class is taking into question. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for listening and watching, and we will catch up with you in the next contextualized reading. Have a great day.